أهلا بكم. هذا الذي يحدث في إفريقيا، هل هو ربيع كاكي تنفذه الجيوش لإحداث التغيير في بلدانها، أم نهاية للأنظمة التي انبثقت عن الاستعمار، أم تجديد لها، أم هو نهاية الفرنس أفريك؟ هل هناك يد وحيدة خلفها؟ هل هي صينية أم روسية؟ وماذا عن أمريكا؟ ثم ما المتوقع بعد هذا؟ أتحدث اليوم إلى مبعوث الأمريكي السابق في منطقتي الساحل الإفريقي والبحيرات الكبرى السفير جون بيتر فان. أحييكم من العربية أينما كنتم، أنا منتهى الرمحي وهذا البعد الآخر. وكما ذكرت، ضيف اليوم هو جون بيتر فام، الأكاديمي والدبلوماسي الأمريكي المتخصص بالشؤون الإفريقية، حيث شغل منصب مبعوث الولايات المتحدة الخاص لمنطقة البحيرات الكبرى حتى عام 2020، ثم مبعوثها للساحل الإفريقي حتى يناير 2021. كتب أكثر من 300 مقال وتحليل، وألف 10 كتب، أحدثها يحمل عنوان الصومال: إصلاح الدولة الأكثر فشلاً في إفريقيا. كما تقلد أرفع الأوسمة من مالي وبوركينا فاسو والنيجر والغابون وبوروندي. السفير فام لن يحدثنا فقط عن تجربته الخاصة في إفريقيا، بل عن القارة كلها وما يحدث فيها الآن. في السنوات الثلاث الأخيرة عاد بقوة زمن الضباط وسط وغرب إفريقيا، في مالي وغينيا، بوركينا فاسو، النيجر، وصولا إلى الغابون بعد المرور بتشاد طبعا. 8 انقلابات في 3 سنوات، اضطرابات ومرتزقة وداعش والقاعدة وغيرها. وهذه الأحداث تأتي في ظرف دولي هش، يبدو فيه مجلس الأمن معطلا على وقع مواجهة غربية روسية شرسة مسرحها أوكرانيا. شهدت إفريقيا منذ عام 1950 وحتى اليوم طبعا 221 انقلابا عسكريا، بنسبة 44% من إجمالي عدد الانقلابات العسكرية في العالم. هذا طبعا ما يشرح الطقوس الإفريقية الخاصة في تداول السلطة، وما جرى في النيجر وما يجري في الغابون الآن ربما سيحدث في مكان آخر، ربما الكاميرون والجارة الكونغو وحتى غينيا الاستوائية بحسب قراءات بعض الخبراء. لكن إفريقيا مع ذلك تبقى قارة شبه شابة جدا، ستكون بعد 7 سنوات ثاني أكبر تجمع سكاني في العالم بعد الهند، وربما حتى قبل الصين، وهي سوق ضخمة وفيها وعود هائلة وثروة من الطاقة لا تقارن، وأهم هذه الثروات المعادن التي تسيل لعاب الجميع، لكنها مع ذلك يموت منها المئات يوميا، تلفظ البحار جثثهم على سواحل المتوسط بين تونس والمغرب. اسمحوا لي أن أرحب بسعادة السفير جون بيتر فام. أهلا بك معنا سعادة السفير.
Thank you.
لو طلبت منك أن تلخص ما يحدث الآن في إفريقيا بشكل سريع من النيجر إلى الغابون.
Certainly. Well, Africa is and remains one of the most dynamic places and regions on the planet, with a growing population, a young population with tremendous opportunities in economic growth, natural resources, but it's also plagued by very poor governance. And as we've seen, unfortunately, in recent weeks, also instability with military coups that have overthrown established leadership. And in the meantime, facing instability from terrorist organizations and extremists, as well as malevolent outside actors.
كل هذه الدول تقريبا
balance of both opportunity and at the same time extreme challenges.
لكن كل هذه الدول التي شهدت انقلابات كلها تقريبا أنت شخصياً عملت فيها أو كانت لك تجارب فيها. خلينا نفصل قليلاً في هذا الموضوع. نبدأ من أحدث الانقلابات من الغابون. هل يمكن أن يكون فشل الغرب أو التجمعات الإقليمية الإفريقية مثل تكتل المجموعة الاقتصادية لدول غرب إفريقيا، فشلهم في إجهاض الانقلابات العسكرية وإعادة الحكم المدني إلى النيجر ومالي على سبيل المثال، هل يمكن أن يكون هو السبب الذي شجع العسكريين في الغابون ليطيحوا بالرئيس علي بونغو؟ وإحنا بنعرف أنه هناك قرابة بين بونغو والقائد العسكري الجديد في الغابون أيضاً.
Individual. There are unique circumstances in each country, but as you rightly point out, there are some commonalities, and I think you singled out a very important one, which is the failure of the international community, but in particular of African institutions, regional organizations, whether it be the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, for the West African countries, or the Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS, in the case of Gabon, that have condemned coups, but they've been unable, in fact, impuissant to restore previous governments. And I think that has emboldened others who might be contemplating the same to know that they face few consequences if they can brave it out. And I think, so that is a major challenge, is the fact that Africa's institutions have not matched their rhetoric and their aspirations with action. So it's a pretty good bet that if you can succeed, you may be able to hold on to power. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. At the same time, however, I think it's important to keep in mind that what came before these coups, I'm talking about all of them generically, not a specific one, is often taken for granted. And I don't think that should be. I think we need to also look at what might have contributed to these things, not to justify the coups, but at least to understand better the context in which they occur. In many respects, that last most recent coup, the one in Gabon, could arguably be called a friendly coup. The new president is himself a distant relation of the previous one, President Ali Bongo Ondimba. And in fact, it was relatively cordial in the sense that the former president was not imprisoned or there are threats. And in fact, today, spokesman for the transitional authorities announced that the former president, Ali Bongo Ondimba, was free to travel abroad. There are no restrictions on him. Now, his wife, who was one of the grievances that led to the coup, is being detained, as well as one of their sons with her, as well as another son, Nuruddin, being held on suspicion of corruption by the new authorities. But the former president himself has been free to travel, as is his adopted son. So it's a different scenario than what has transpired in other countries.
صحيح، لكن لو انطلقنا أبعد من هذه الانقلابات التي نشاهدها هذه الأيام في بعض الدول الإفريقية، المسألة ليست انقلاب مرة واحدة، انقلابات متكررة، حالة يأس من الوصول إلى حالة مرضية للشعوب في الدول الإفريقية، حالة تراجع، حالة تأخر. ما السبب برأيك؟ يعني هل الاستعمار ممكن أن يكون يتحمل جزئية من هذا السبب؟
Well, I think certainly a lot goes back to the colonial state. And if one were engaged in academia, and I come out of an academic background before I went into diplomacy, one should probably begin not just with the colonial state, but the pre-colonial state and how these were constructed. But in practical terms, we have to look and the question I always raised when I was the United States special envoy for the Sahel region in particular was that I emphasized that the root causes of many of these, of the instability, and this was before the coups began, was a crisis of state legitimacy, that the governments failed to provide basic goods, basic services that citizens did not feel that the government was looking out for them or had their best interests in mind. And certainly this alienation from the state makes possible an environment in which someone can seize power and there's acceptance, acquiescence, and in fact, in some cases, as we've seen, people cheering the coup, not because they are in favor of constitutions being disrespected or governments being overthrown, but because the coup leaders very cleverly offer them a hope of a quick resolution of problems, whether the problems be insecurity, corruption, lack of development, lack of the sharing of the wealth of the country. So they hope for a quick solution. And very often, unfortunately, those hopes are disappointed, but one understands where they spring from.
وللأسف كل هاي الوعود لا ينفذ منها شيء. لكن لو عدنا معك إلى انقلاب النيجر، في هذا الملف رأي الولايات المتحدة معارض تماما لرأي فرنسا، لماذا برأيك؟
Well, I think the United States is being very pragmatic, and I think that's what it's needed. If we look at what came, the Niger coup was unique. Well, they are all unique, but unique in the fact that it did not occur because the government was not performing. In fact, the government that was overthrown, the one led by President Mohamed Bazoum, was itself doing well. It was the first time in the history of Niger as an independent country that an elected president, Mohamed Issoufou, handed power to an elected successor peacefully, Mohamed Bazoum. So that itself represented progress. In terms of security, with the assistance of the United States, training, and in fact, lives given, we recall the incident in Tonga in the northeast part of Niger, where a number of American Special Forces operators were killed alongside their Nigerian counterparts a few years ago. With the training, improved training of these units, security had actually increased. The first half of this year, the level of violence by extremist groups, by terrorists, was at the lowest level in 5 years. A number of development outcomes have improved. Children enrolled in schools, including girls. The elimination of certain health challenges like river blindness. So there have been improvements. The problem there in Niger was actually the pace of change. Although the progress was noticeable, people were impatient. And on top of that, you had some personnel issues with the commander of the presidential guard, who has now installed himself as president, with the former chief of staff of the defense forces, who was dismissed from his position. And so you had some personal rivalries, but it was not a matter of non-performance. Now, moving that ahead, your question about the United States and France. I think the United States' position is to try to engage and to protect those gains, the security gains, which were noticeable, the development gains, that there's no reason to lose all that just because there's a coup. Not that we condone coups, we continue to condemn it and call for the release of the elected president, Mohamed Bazoum. But at the same time, one shouldn't sacrifice all the gains. And in fact, it's been very telling that there have been protests, even violent protests, in front of the French embassy, in front of French military installations. The new government has repudiated 5 defense and security agreements with France. It has ordered the French ambassador to be expelled. In fact, the deadline has passed for that, although he remains in country. But it hasn't moved in anywhere in that direction with respect to the United States. There have been no protests in front of the American embassy, no demands that the over 1,000 United States military personnel based in that country and carrying out intelligence work that's important, not just for Niger, but for the entire region. There's no.
صحيح. وهذا يقودني لسؤالك، إن كان من الممكن أسألك عن خطأ فرنسا. أين تراه؟ هل كان خطأ فردي من الرئيس الحالي ماكرون ولا فشل في السياسة الفرنسية بشكل عام؟
I think it's a long-term failure that France tried, and this is going back several generations, in the wake of independence of new countries, tried to still maintain economic advantages it has as the colonial power, tried to maintain a certain political influence. And as time went by, France's capabilities vis-a-vis the world order were much diminished today than they were 50, 60 years ago. But they tried to still act as if they had the power that they once had. And of course, that's not the reality. And the economic exploitation, the overdue, exaggerated influence in national politics, all that added up. I mean, a good example is the French ambassador who's being expelled from Niger, Sylvain Ité. He used to be the French representative for public diplomacy in Africa and was noted for getting into the gutter, so to speak, on social media and arguing with people in the most ridiculous fashion. He famously caused a controversy earlier this year by telling Nigerians that they didn't like Europeans that stopped drinking the water because Europe had paid for the waste treatment plant in Niamey. Well, those are things a diplomat doesn't say. And so I think there's a certain arrogance, to be quite frank. And it's a political calculation on the part of the governments that take power, that because France is unpopular, because it is weakened, because of social media campaign, we have to acknowledge also manipulation of social media. People are in a very strong anti-French mood. So they gain popularity by attacking someone who is already unpopular. So we have to acknowledge that as well.
سعادة السفير جون بيتر فام، نرجو أن تبقى معنا، سنذهب إلى فاصل قصير، نعود بعده لمتابعة الجزء الثاني من البعد الآخر. ابقى معنا. أهلا بكم معنا من جديد إلى الجزء الثاني من البعد الآخر وحوارنا مع السفير جون بيتر فام المبعوث الأمريكي السابق لمنطقتي البحيرات الكبرى والساحل الإفريقي. يرحب بك معنا من جديد سعادة السفير. وكنا نتحدث قبل الفاصل عن فرنسا والسياسة الفرنسية. قبل أن أنتقل لتفاصيل أخرى فيما يتعلق بالانقلابات، هل ما يحدث الآن في هذه الدول الإفريقية هو استبدال للوصاية الفرنسية ودخول تحت النفوذ الروسي بأي شكل من الأشكال؟
Well, I think Russia has operating whether directly or indirectly through proxies like what was the Wagner Group, trying to act opportunistically, where there are openings created either because of a failure of Western countries or just desperation on the part of those who are now in authority or in power. Russia doesn't have the resources in terms of personnel or wealth to fully engage the way other powers have. But they've been very clever, and one has to acknowledge, very smart about how they do it. With what resources they do have, using the means they do have, they look for opportunities, whether it be in Mali, where Wagner mercenaries are fighting alongside the government, whether it be in the Central African Republic, where there's not been a coup, but there's a president who was elected by really a fraction of the population in very flawed elections, and who recently had the Russian mercenary group Wagner help administer a laughable referendum in which he abolished term limits and extended his time in office. And supposedly, 90% of the people approved of this thing. And so I think there's opportunism, and they exploit it, but they certainly are not going to be a replacement in terms of either economic development or social assistance, or certainly providing sustainable long-term security. What they do provide, and this is important to distinguish, not so much protection for the state or state building, they provide protection for the regime that is in power. And that's a much more narrow task, certainly one that they've accomplished well for the clients they have, but it's not to the long-term benefit of the countries or peoples involved.
يعني قد يكون هكذا صحيح، لكن في الصورة الكبرى لو نظرنا من بعيد لما يحدث، هل هو جزء من الصراع الأوروبي الروسي الذي بدأ في أوكرانيا والآن نراه في إفريقيا؟ هل يمكن قراءته بهذا الشكل؟
Well, it certainly, for Russia, it's an opportunity to expand its influence, to also distract the West, whether it be Europeans or Americans, to diverting resources that might go to the war against Russian aggression in Ukraine, to spend it in Africa. That certainly would suit for a very minimal investment. So in a way, if one looks at it objectively in a detached manner, it's a smart investment on their part. But as I said, what comes with it, not only human rights abuses, but also the theft of natural resources in countries, the takeover of mines, of other things, national assets, it's not for the long-term benefit of the peoples of these African countries, even if individual elites gain from it. And it's not entirely clear right now whether a takeover of what used to be the Wagner operation by the Russian state is possible. They're certainly going to try, but I have difficulty believing that the bureaucracy, which can I even fight the war in Ukraine to victory, is capable of managing a complex enterprise that involves not just fighters, but also managing businesses, illicit or not, and marketing of resources. It's very complex, and the Russian bureaucracy has shown how fragile it is and how incompetent it is.
طيب، في الصورة المباشرة يتوالى سقوط أنظمة حكم كان يفترض أنه قبضتها قوية. تسقط هذه الأنظمة على أيدي ضباط شباب طموحين يؤيدهم جيل جديد من الشباب اللي هو شاعر بطبيعة الحال بخيبة الأمل بسبب عدم تحقيق وعود ديمقراطية طوال عقود من الزمن. هذا بخلينا نقارن مع ويقودنا إلى مستعمرة فرنسية سابقة أصبحت الآن مثال للاستقرار والنمو في القارة الإفريقية، رواندا. أول ما قام به بول كاغامي أوائل هذا القرن هو أنه قطع مع فرنسا وتوجه نحو بريطانيا، حتى أنه أصبح رجل بريطانيا في إفريقيا. هل تتصور أنه بول كاغامي هو ملهم لهذه التحركات ولو بطريقة غير مباشرة؟
Well, I think Rwanda certainly is a wonderful example of a country that faced the total collapse of the state, of genocide even, the state turning its machinery inward to kill its own citizens because they belong to a different group, the genocide against the Tutsi. And the reconstruction of that country has been a marvel. And I think it's certainly a lesson to everyone. Rwanda has been a leader on the continent. That's why the African Union entrusted President Kagame with the unenviable task, which he has taken on, trying to reform African institutions. Now, that may be he's a great man, but that may be a task even too big for even him. But he's certainly trying. So it's an example of what can be done when a country seeks to build itself up and chart an independent course of foreign policy. Whether that level of discipline is achievable everywhere, that vision, that's a different story. But certainly a good example of a country that, despite and none of the countries that have had coups have fallen to where Rwanda was when the genocide was ended by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the movement that ended the genocide and took power, led by Paul Kagame. But it's a good example of what can be achieved if there's enough willpower and enough discipline and pragmatism, the part of Britain in helping Rwanda, but of other countries as well. It's, Rwanda is a good partner of a number of countries, not just in the West, but also, being very frank, also in the East, and certainly among the Arab countries of the Middle East as well.
تحدثنا عن روسيا، عن أوروبا، تحديدا فرنسا ودخول بريطانيا لموضوع رواندا، لكن بقيت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. في منطقة الساحل فشل مكافحة الجماعات الإرهابية مثل داعش والقاعدة بمساعدة فرنسا. أثر هذا غضب السكان وشجع على الإطاحة بهذه الأنظمة في دول مثل مالي والنيجر عبر الانقلابات العسكرية. ما هو دور سنتكم إفريقيا مثلا؟ ليش الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تبدو وكأنها مستقيلة أو متخلية عن هذه المنطقة؟
No, I would say it's incorrect. In fact, just this week, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, my good friend, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, was in Chad in the Sahel, visiting refugees who had been displaced from Sudan. In fact, Chad, African country in the Sahel, has taken in more refugees since the conflict broke out in Sudan than any other country. In fact, a majority, more than 50% of the refugees who've left Sudan in recent months have gone to Chad. And she was there and announced a large program of additional assistance. America remains the largest contributor to humanitarian assistance on the African continent. But even on the military level, I would argue that Niger, the coup notwithstanding, was actually a security success. Over the last decade, U.S. training, assistance, equipment, intelligence provided by the two air bases that we operate in Niger have been instrumental in helping the Nigerian government itself win back territory. In fact, as I said, the level of violence by extremist terrorists at the first 6 months of this year was at the lowest level since 2018. That's a remarkable achievement. Even in Tonga Tonga, in the Tillaberi prefecture, in the northwestern part of Niger, where American soldiers were killed alongside their Nigerian colleagues just a few years ago, displaced people are being resettled. So that's an example of what can be accomplished militarily, equipping partners. And I think that's what the point I tried to make when I said we should not give that all up. We should try to protect those gains and, if possible, enlarge them. And if that can be done, and malevolent outside forces like Russia's Wagner can be kept out, then I think it's a win not only for the United States in the great game of power competition, but also a win for the African peoples of the countries involved. And so I think we're going to remain engaged. We should remain engaged because it's not just their security, but it's our security and that of the international community to defeat these death cults of extremists.
طرحنا على أنفسنا السؤال لماذا المستعمرات الفرنسية السابقة تحديداً هي اللي بتشهد هذه الانقلابات وهذه التحركات؟
You know, that's a complex question. As I said, each coup is individual. There are unique circumstances to each one. But, you know, I think historically, speaking as an academic, as someone who has taught at universities, one has to acknowledge that, you know, there was something different in the French both colonial experience and post-colonial experience that perhaps hollowed out institutions and did not privilege building them the way perhaps that would have made them a little stronger. I think there's something to be said about that. And certainly, you know, there are numerous cases where tolerance of systems that were you know, quite frankly, corrupt and undemocratic went on for a long time. I cite the example of Guinea, Conakry, the Republic of Guinea, where the 2010 election, which installed a winner who, frankly, I don't believe won the election. I believe it was a fraud. And, you know, France still protected Alpha Condé in 2015, when in a very fraudulent, non-transparent poll, he was again declared the winner. Then he violated the Constitution in 2020 and abolished term limits and claimed to have won another victory, again with which French complacency. So when, you know, one has an illegitimate head of state to begin with, who did not actually get elected, don't be surprised if you do not give people an option to deal with you one way peacefully. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. They will find another way. And so I think there's a lot to be said about that, but I would caution against drawing overly broad conclusions. It's not that everything France did was bad, but I think there was sufficient enough to cause France the problems it has today. And in many respects,
ولكن بكل الظروف يعني هذا السؤال كان مبرر، طرح هذا السؤال مبرر لدى الكثيرين ممن تابعوا ما الذي يحدث في إفريقيا. سعادة السفير جون بيتر فام الأكاديمي والدبلوماسي الأمريكي، شكرا جزيلا لك على المشاركة معنا، ألف شكر. وإلى هنا انتهت حلقة اليوم من البعد الآخر. يمكنكم دائما متابعتنا على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي تويتر أو إكس، فيسبوك ويوتيوب. كما يمكنكم الاستماع إلى حلقتنا على العربية بودكاست ومشاهدتها على منصة شاهد. إلى اللقاء.